Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah ma ba'd. So, before we jump into the next section where we cover the principles of language learning, some of the most important principles, I just want to answer a question by one of the students. They said, how can we define fluency, or what does fluency mean in one sentence? So, if I try to be very pedantic about this, I would say that fluency is how confident and competent you feel in expressing a concept or an idea. So confidence and competent. Okay, so competence would mean how much knowledge and conceptual framework and grounding you have in that concept that you're trying to inshallah explain, and then combine that with confidence. Okay, so those two things, when they come together, right, in expressing a concept, will determine how fluent you are. So fluency, as I've said, is always subject specific. It's always topic specific, right? The more specific you go into a topic, the more fluent you are in that specific niche. For example, you might have a master's in law, right, in a specific field of it, such as criminal law. That would mean that you're fluent in some of the important topics of criminal law, but you may not be fluent in the topics of family law or human rights law, whatever the case may be, right? You may have the competency to learn those things very quickly, but you're not as competent and confident in expressing the ideas and the concepts covered in those other areas of law, right? But you, after a master's, you are at least confident and competent in expressing any broad idea or topic in your specific field, right? Now, there might be many subfields in that area, in the area of criminal law, right? Where you might not have that competence. So that is a very high level competence, right? And then some PhD would discuss that topic in their thesis, and they will be much more fluent in that specific niche than you are, right? Although you are just as fluent as them, generally speaking, in law, and more fluent in the subfield of criminal law, but less fluent in that high-end niche topic within that field. Okay, I hope that clarifies. Bid'Allah ta'ala. So how confident and competent you are in expressing a concept or a thought in your communication, inshallah. Okay. Fluency is mostly to do with language output. You might be very, very competent and confident in taking in information, but that does not mean you're fluent, because fluidity is the flow of things, right? Fluency is from fluidity. So fluidity is normally, when you take something from an area of high concentration to low concentration, right? And normally in the world of language learning, we mean it to specifically relate to the output of language. Okay, so that is why many of the subcontinent and other non-Arab countries where they learn the Deen of Allah, they study the Deen, even in English speaking parts of the world where they have seminaries and universities, they might be competent in understanding the written word, in generally speaking, right? And of course, that competence grows as they read more literature in that science, in that field, and they become more confident in that as a result of it. But it doesn't mean that they're automatically competent and confident in expressing the same concepts. طيب? Is that clear, inshallah? So we may jump into the next section. Right. How would we define it for the Arabic language? So we would say that the Arabic language, like any other language, has a general body of language, which we normally, the language that defines the language that we normally use on a daily basis, right? So that's the foundation, right? So when you become fluent in expressing daily life concerns, right? Buying, shopping, renting, going out, managing your daily affairs, that will be when you've become fluent in a general sense of it, right? But then beyond that, right, the more you read in different sciences, the more fluent you will become in that specific field. And that is relevant to all languages, right? And especially applies to the Arabic language. In the context of studying for the Deen of Allah Azza wa Jal, studying Islamic sciences and Islamic studies, what it means, fluency would mean that you've read at least, in a general sense. Of course, the general fluency comes before the specific fluency, right? So in the general sense, that would mean that you have covered at least a beginner plus an intermediate level text in that science, in a specific science, right? And then you become fluent in that specific science. And then once you've covered the whole body of the fundamental sciences like usul fiqh, usul hadith, usul tafsir, nahu, sarf, balagha, basic tafsir of the Quran, X, Y, and Z, right? Once you've studied all of this, then you've become generally fluent in all of the subjects, right? And normally when people graduate from universities, right, four-year degrees, they have essentially just become generally fluent in the Islamic sciences, in the Arabic language. Okay? And then of course when they go into to do masters and whatnot, they become more specifically fluent in a specific field, right? So when we normally discuss fluency, it's always discussed in the general sense of how natives use a language on a daily basis. Okay? And then beyond that, it's always going to be subject specific. It's always going to be academic. How much have you read in a specific field? Let's say cooking, right? I'm sure you have cooking books in your native languages, right? Or other languages that you speak. Likewise, you have cookbooks in Arabic, right? You might be, let's say a scholar of, Sharia, right? You've spent 4 years becoming generally fluent in all the sciences, and then becoming a master, specifically fluent in your area. But you might have no idea, what a cookbook says. You'll be able to understand everything that it says, but you might not be able to express it, right? So, again, taking in of input of the language, input of the language, that has its specific fluency if you want to express it in that word. But we normally use fluency for the output of language, okay? And likewise in Arabic, you will become fluent in a general sense once you can speak and write Arabic to a general sense where you can read and communicate on a level of a newspaper, perhaps, right? And then beyond that is your subject-specific fluency, where you can now start to discuss Islamic subjects, right? Fiqh and hadith and tafsir and usul and X, Y, and Z, right? So it happens in those stages. And of course in the input, the competency of understanding comes way before fluency in expressing the ideas, right? There is another field of so they call these the four skills, right? The reading, listening, speaking, and writing. But there's a fifth one, which is understanding, the conceptual framework, the conceptual paradigms that you form in your mind, right? That is also one of the skills that you learn over time. So you may become very competent in reading and listening, but you may not have very good competence in speaking or writing, right? Because perhaps you don't have a need for that, and that is fine. We don't have to, inshallah, become fluent in that sense. But what is more important than the speaking and writing is the conceptual fluency. How confidently can you engage with new ideas in a different language? Because as a non-native, and I was going to discuss this in the next slide, but just to touch upon it here, when you're living in a non-Arab land and your native tongue is not Arabic, all the language you're learning all the knowledge you're learning in Arabic, you don't have a direct need to express it in Arabic, right? you have a need to express it in your native tongue that people understand around you, right? So knowledge can be attained in a much quicker way if we just focus on the first two, right? But if you want to develop yourself in a well-rounded talib al-ilm and inshallah an alim or alima, then you need to go the full route. Otherwise, the standard 4-year alima course or alimiyah courses, that's all they teach you. They give you, they teach you, they build your reading competency, a bit of grammar, and then they teach you everything via translation, essentially translation, right? So you don't acquire the language, and you don't become fluent, as in fluent in terms of outputting the language, right? Yet you can become confident enough in discussing the ideas in your native tongue that you've read in an Arabic book. Okay, hopefully that clarifies. Let's jump into the principles, inshallah, of language learning. So we've also already mentioned a lot of these key terms, so we'll just make it quick, bidhnillahi ta'ala. The two golden principles, the two eyes of language learning, the most important thing, everything falls underneath. These are the umbrella terms, and everything falls into this, right? Imitation and immersion. Okay? Imitation and immersion. We've mentioned these terms before, but imitation is when you imitate a native actively, in terms of all skills, in terms of the input of the language that involves listening. So the spoken word, you're listening to the spoken word. You're reading, so you're in contact with the written word, and the body language, the hand gestures, the mouth movements, the facial expressions, all of that, right? You're actively trying to copy that in person. Okay, you actively try to copy that in person, right? As best as you can, right? And then you of course find a way of creating some sort of feedback loops where you can self-correct yourself and you keep improving in that manner. And then you can have some other people, they can sort of tell you, oh, mashallah, you sound very native in this I thought you're an Arab. This is how I started my language journey. One of the first things I learned was كيف حالك, right? How are you? And that's the only thing I could say. So what I would do is I would go to my local masjid and I would find any Arab brother I could find, and with as much energy and Arabness I could muster, I would say to them, Assalamu alaikum kayfa haluk, right? And I would try my best to imitate an Arab to the best of my ability. And the person in front of me, they, sometimes it would confuse me to be, for an Arab. And then, after kayfa haluk, they'll just keep going on in Arabic, and I'm standing there thinking, I have no idea what you just said. And then they will find that, I'm not an Arab, and so that's how I would learn the next thing, and the next thing, and you keep adding up those, those things. Okay, so imitation, actively listening, reading, whatever form of medium of language you come in contact with, you're active with it, right? And inshallah, I'll describe what I mean by active in a bit more detail in a second, but you actively engage with any medium, any content that you come in contact with. Okay, so when you listen, you actively pay attention to the tones, the words, the phrases. Perhaps you pick up a word here and there, and then you try and make sense of everything else that connects with it, right? So all of that is going, but we're trying to copy the person. You actively listen, you take in the content, everything, right? As I've said, everything about a person, you take that in, right? And then you try and say it, even under your breath. You don't want them to think that as if you're copying them. You mimicking them, and you're trying. Some person could be offended by that, but if you just could do it under your breath, and it's the foundation of language learning, imitation. There's a lot of research on this. Kids, this is and when you do this imitation, right, actively every day for a sustained period of time, we call this immersion, right? Immersion essentially can be described as you actively engaging with the language And then when you try and imitate the source of the content, the person, the native, then you're imitating them, right? So immersion is to actively engage with the language, and then imitation is to copy it, right? As neatly as a native Arab does it. Okay? So imitation and immersion. So immersion, again, just so everyone is clear in a single line, is your active engagement with the language, okay? And imitation is you try and mimic and imitate the source of the language, i.e. the native speaker, right? As closely as possible, right? And you do it again. You do it very quickly. You do it almost instantly. And you try and, self-correct yourself, and you keep going, keep moving forward until you have reached a very, very good level, right? You almost sound native, inshallah. And this imitation is the principle of any learning, to be honest. It's not just language learning. You can imitate the great masters of any science. In fact, one of the latest research points to the fact that the first step of mastery and creative mastery, where you're doing something which no one else has done before, and you're coming up with with very nuanced output. You're creating things which no one has even thought of, right? But all of that, like someone like Leonardo da Vinci and others, who were known as a renowned creative artists and engineers of that time. It all starts with imitating, copying, essentially, right? Your teacher. So you start with mastering the art of imitation. Once you've imitated enough and you've reached mastery in that, then you can automatically move on to the production in a very creative sense. Everything just sort of reorganizes itself in your mind, and you come up with something new. Right? So imitation is the foundation of all learning and all mastery, all fluency, inshallah. Right, so how do you imitate, and how best do you actively listen and read and speak and write? Okay, so just an example of active and non-active listening. Say you come across news on the TV, and it's in Arabic, it's Al Jazeera, for example, and you just listen to it. Just listening to it without paying attention to the tones of how the person is speaking, the pauses, the elongations, and then of course trying to make sense of how certain phrases are being used again and again, and trying to pick some things from that. If you're not trying to do that, would you classify that as active listening or non-active listening? Non-active, right? Exactly. On the other hand, let's say you have the same news playing in front of you, but this time you have a paper and pen on in your hands, and as you observe the speaker speaking, and you're noting their pauses and whatnot, right? Linguists, by the way, they have notations to mark different kinds of pauses and elongations, and these ilmam, as we call it in Arabic, and X, Y, and Z, right? So they have notations for this. But anyway, let's say you don't have it, but you're noticing it carefully, and you have a paper and pen in your hand, and every word that you have perhaps learned elsewhere, it pops up in the video, you know it. Okay, right? You sort of pay attention to that, and then anything that comes after it, or the phrases that make sense to you, or perhaps you don't know that phrase before, or you haven't learned that phrase before, but the context of it teaches you the meaning of it. So you've just learned something new. You write that down. You write down that phrase, right? And then say they're saying something, and you don't know what it means, or you didn't know what it mean or what it meant. But in the video, they've shared a picture of it, and they've said the words again and again, right? You write that down. Okay, this means this, right? So you're actively mining, you're actively, digging for these kinds of, knowledge nuggets, not language nuggets, right? Would you describe this as active or non-active? Active, certainly active, right? And common sense will tell you you can't do this active learning for a very long time. Non-active listening and reading is beneficial, right? But if it remains the main part of your learning, you're not going to immerse yourself. I mean, non-active listening is being done by those people who have spent years in a foreign country but they don't speak a word of it. It's not going to help you in the fluency of the language, right? So active listening and reading is what we aim for, right? And this is what's going to classify as immersion. If you're not doing this, even if you're in the heart of that land, even if someone throws you in the heart of Shakespearean era, you will not end up producing something like Shakespeare, or something close to it, or even something that resembles it, right? So that's active. So output, when it comes to output, being active and non-active looks like as follows. So a person, they've been trying to learn, let's say they've been very active with their listening and reading, right? They've been collecting phrases and whatnot. But whenever they read something in English or their mother tongue, they don't try and test themselves on how would I say this in Arabic, right? Or when they're speaking, they don't try and, they might know something, they might know how to say a phrase in Arabic, for example, but they just choose to say it in their language. Is that non-active speaking or active speaking, using the language they are learning? Yes, so they're being active with their mother tongue still, but they're not being non-active. They're being non-active with using the new language they're learning, right? Because they're choosing not to use it. Okay. Let's say the other example. Let's say there's a student on the other hand. They learn a language by reading actively and listening actively, and they acquire a lot of vocabulary in that sense, phrasal vocabulary. And then what they do is periodically they have let's say a storybook, and they try and translate a paragraph of that every day for, let's say, once a day, or once every 2 days, or once or twice a week, for example, let's say, right? And the more they read, the more they question themselves, okay, I don't know how to say this in Arabic, how could I learn to say this in Arabic? And then they perhaps use resources like Google Translate, Reverso, or ChatGPT that we will discuss in the coming sections, inshallah. But they're actively trying to learn how to say what they don't know how to say, and they're actually trying to translate what they already know they can say in Arabic, and they try and output that language. Is this person being active or non-active? They're being very active, right? And then there's a person who lives amongst the Arabs, a huge Arab community nearby, in the mosque, in the masjid and whatever, but they choose to speak to them in English because he knows he's lazy, everyone speaks English, so might as well not bother myself speaking Arabic. Is this person an active speaker or non-active speaker of Arabic? They might, exchange كيف حالك here and there, but beyond that, they don't really, stress themselves in expressing. Right? This person is non-active. But then on the other hand, you might have a person who does not fear embarrassing themselves, and they just muster the courage, and they just say whatever comes to mind, even if it's wrong, because they know that everyone will somehow correct them. Even if they make fun of them, doesn't matter, they will still correct them. So they try and output the language, and over time they know they're going to be corrected, and over time they're going to become more confident and going to be using the same things again and again. Believe it or not, 80% of the words, right? 20% of the words are used 80% of the time in daily communications, right? Daily communications. I mean, as an example, you can learn like a set of 9 to 10 greetings, and Arabs, they spend like 10 minutes on saying the same words. كيف حالك؟ بخير. عساكم طيب. إيش أخبار؟ شو أخبار؟ Right? And they would repeat the same things again and again. They go on for like 10-15 minutes. So you can easily buy active, like speaking time with an Arab using the same phrases of كيف حالك. Like I've literally seen One of my friends from Medina, his father came to visit us in the Jamia, and I saw them having this conversation. They started with pleasantries, and then every few minutes they will revert back to كيف حالك شو أخبارك, how are things, كيف الأمور. And it's so funny because we don't do that in as English speakers, right? But you have native Arabs just asking each other how they are every few seconds, every few minutes, right? So if 20% of the language is going to be used 80% of the time, you're going to learn the most important language very, very soon if you actively pursue speaking. Okay? So let's come back now. We've touched upon a few things. Phrase mining, I've mentioned this word, right? So phrase mining combined with comprehensible input, using language from day one, and just-in-time learning. These three things, inshallah, are the primary principles of language learning because they essentially inform your imitation, what you need to imitate, essentially. Right? You don't need to imitate useless things, like how a person, because things could vary from person to person. You don't need to copy someone's dressing style, although you could do if you, for example, in an Arab country, when in Rome, dress like the Romans, of course, in the halal sense. But imitating someone in that thing could potentially be a waste of time, right? So you're imitating for the right things, and these are the three principles that are the productive kind of, that is the productive kind of imitation. So phrase mining essentially is when you dig for new phrases to use in your language. For example, you don't know how to say, let's say you wanna ask someone, how do you say this in Arabic? But you don't know how to say that in Arabic, right? So you learn that. So actively, search for phrases that you could possibly use in your own day-to-day life. That's one example of it. That's in output kind of case scenario. Then, when you're reading, you read a line, right, of Arabic, right? For example, I've been sending you guys daily quizzes. For example, it says الفتاة تذهب إلى المدرسة كل يوم, right? The girl goes to the madrasa, goes to the school every day. So it says al-fatah, which is a girl, right? That's a standalone word, so we're not interested in that just as yet. But al-fatatu tadhhab, now that's a phrase. The girl goes, right? You could contrast this. Okay, so if a girl goes, how would I say a boy goes? And then you can search, use ChatGPT and say, or Google Translate and find the difference. Al-fatatu tadhhabu and al-fatah yadhhab. Okay? Al-fatah yadhhab, al-fatatu tadhhab. So you're essentially, noticing how the two words, so you write it down in your phrase book. That's a phrase you've just learned. طيب. تذهب إلى المدرسة. How would I say, she goes to the supermarket, right? You would say تذهب إلى السوق. So you just change the noun at the end and the phrase remains the same. So you actively phrase mine, right? You actively mine for such new information. And of course, very soon, most of the phrases that are being used will become, very, very normal and easy for you because the language repeats itself, right? But the more you do it, the more phrases you acquire, the more fluent you're going to become in terms of the general fluency of the language. That is the first step, okay? And the second principle is, and of course, this is going to be done actively from our side, so we're going to be doing most of this work for you, inshallah, right? Most of the phrase mining is going to be done for you in the lectures. All you need to do is just note down things, inshallah. So a lot of this is going to be served to you on a silver spoon, bi'idhnillah. Number 3 is so using language from day one. This is something that puts a lot, people into a lot of stress, but it doesn't have to. You can make it. You can turn it into fun, by, just telling everyone, look, I'm going to do a challenge, right? Where I'm not going to be speaking any English. I'm just going to be speaking Arabic, just to see how much I can progress, right? And if I can progress in a week, I might continue, carrying this on 80% of the time. And so you just make it a challenge with other people. You inform others, and you get down to work, right? So you have to use the language from day one, right? Scott Young in Ultra Learning, you must have the reason why I made you read that book was because there's a lot of concepts I'm discussing in this video that you might not be familiar with. If you read that book, you will understand what I'm trying to say. In that book, they essentially described their language challenge. In a year, they went to 4 different countries, completely different, unrelated languages from different language families, and they learned each of the languages in 3 months to relative fluency, right? A very general speaking fluency, right? And the only technique they actually used was basically this, right? Using the language from day one and collecting phrases they could use on a daily basis. So it's very, very possible to become, fluent on a spoken level in a general sense in as little as 3 months. And I believe I could do it in less than 2 weeks. In less than 2 weeks, in any language, if I was to give it a try myself. Because at this point, I have a method to in my mind that I can take, inshallah. Right. And for anyone who's interested, they can ask me about this, and I'll be happy to describe this for you guys, inshallah. How I approach language learning, and most of the things, most of how I do it, inshallah, I'll be using the same techniques in the course as well for you guys, inshallah. So I'm hoping, inshallah, this will be, you'll be able to learn Arabic a lot faster in that way. So you have to use language from day one. You have to actively phrase mine, okay? And thirdly, you have to do just-in-time learning. You don't learn information which is not relevant to you. Okay, you don't learn information which is not relevant to you. You just learn information which is relevant to you right now. Okay, and inshallah, I'm going to be choosing content which is essentially going to give you that. Okay. And then another thing that you must have learned in the book, if you read it, is the idea of practicing the skill that you want to master in an environment that resembles a real life case scenario. For example, if you want to master the art of boxing, right? You want to master the art of martial arts, let's say. No amount of training in the gym, outdoors, whatever the case may be, is going to train you as best and optimally as a real ring experience would, right? So actually getting in real fighting, right? So of course, this is in the boxing scenario, and of course, I'm not promoting or condoning any of this, but just as an example, the best way to learn to fight is to actually fight. It's not to, you can do all the precursor of that in your ring, like the stamina building, the agility, the mobility, the flexibility, the cardio, or you can do all of that before but nothing will prepare you for the fight like the actual fight. And if you do it for long enough, it will actually build the right kind of stamina, the right kind of agility and mobility that you actually need for the fight. Right? So this is just an example. For language learning, what it means is you have to use a language for the skills that you're going to be using in your talab al-ilm. And that would normally mean translating, right, from English to Arabic, right? Especially concepts of relevance in Islamic studies. Initially, you will just practice because initially we were just aiming for general fluency. So you'll be reading the books which teach you the relevant subject and the relevant vocabulary. So because our focus is on the religious Islamic side of vocabulary more than general vocabulary. Of course, we are going to be covering inshallah a general Arabic curriculum, inshallah. But as a rule of thumb, most of our time after that initial phase is going to be spent on Islamic studies, right? Because that's our religion. That's why we're here for. So, reading relevant literature that propels our understanding and usage of language and taking in of information that is relevant to our field of studies, and then outputting the language in a similar context. For example, when you give da'wah, one of the initial da'wah challenges would be to bring together your family or closer circle of friends and start teaching them what you've learned. So you start engaging the concepts, right? And start using the Arabic phrases that you've learned, for example, right? So many examples of this. But practice the thing in an environment which is as close to what you want to do at the end of it with that skill. Okay? inshallah. So for example, if you want to learn grammar, the end point of all of that is to do i'rab of the Quran, to be able to discuss the beauty of the syntax and the meanings behind the structure of the words in the Quran. So one of the best ways of practicing i'rab and nahu is to actually do it in the Quran, right? After a certain initial fluency of Arabic, inshallah. Because otherwise it can be stressful. For those students who've studied that in that manner, they will know. Right, so that is the three important principles. Now, all of those three combine in your imitation game. Right, astaghfirullah. And imitation, combined with these three things, will actually sort of describe your immersion. This is how your immersion is going to be. You're going to study in this program. You're going to do all the homework, the exercises, the tasks that are set to you with the right tools that, inshallah, we describe for you. And all of that, inshallah, if you trust the system for long enough, inshallah, it will pay its dividends. It will work. So you have to trust the system, inshallah, okay, with all these principles. But for any other language learning adventures that you want to go on to, perhaps you want to learn a language for job purposes, whatever the case may be, you can use all these principles for that, inshallah, okay? Right, last two things we've already discussed. Fluency is always subject specifics. We've touched upon that in detail, so we'll skip that. The last thing we want to touch on is this idea or the problem of memorization of vocabulary. People complain that they've learned something and then they forgot it. They learn something and then they forget, right? A lot of things that they learn. So, a few things. One, going back to the just-in-time learning. If you're learning things which are not relevant to you and you're not going to be using it instantly, right, or at least in the near future, you are going to lose it. It's not going to stick, and it's going to become redundant in your mind, and your mind is not going to. Your mind will just throw it at the back end. You might still remain it might still remain in your mind, and you might recognize the word. Oh, I recognize this word. I've read it somewhere, maybe 10 years ago, but I don't know what it means. And trust me, this has happened to me as well. This can happen to anyone, right? So, and for example, even the English language, right? I've mentioned this to some of the students before, that since I don't live in England anymore, and I spend most of my time engaged with Arabic literature, I've seen how my spoken and my written competence in the English language has has gone down a bit. Right, it's not at the same level of competency as it was back in when I was in England, right? When I was engaging with the academia. So this is something that happens when you either use it or lose it, right? You have to actively create opportunities for you to use a language, right? So just moving to an Arab country and by the virtue of you being there, hoping that you would master the language is a dream. It's a dream that will turn into a nightmare after a few years that you've wasted there. So we don't want to go down that route, right? We want to take these principles and we want to act on them. So memorization of vocabulary is essentially comes down to the principle of just-in-time learning and then using it. There's a few ways of using it, inshallah. One way of using it is to use it in your daily life, right? Because you're sticking to using the language from day one, you're going to be using a lot of things, and over time you're going to constantly check yourself and, okay, how can I say this better? How can I improve on saying the same thing I'm saying in Arabic, but say it even better, inshallah? Sound a bit more, perhaps poetic, right? Perhaps a bit more, eloquent in that sense, right? So that's one. The second thing is to have your phrase book, as I'll describe in the next section, and to review it on a weekly basis, or initially on a daily basis, and then after a few months of study on a weekly basis, where you have a phrase book of your own, where you have English phrases on the left side and Arabic on the right side. You cover the right side and you just go through the entire phrase book. It's a small, so I'll describe it in the next section, inshallah, anyway, but it's a pocket-sized phrase book. It's not too long, right? It's perhaps 50 pages, inshallah, in a notepad. And you just do it once a week, right? Just go through it once a week, right? And the way you do it is actively recalling what you. So you read out so you look at the English, and then you try and answer that in Arabic, right, out loud. And you do this with the entire phrase book, inshallah. And the ones that you struggled with, inshallah, you just you follow the strategy that I'll describe in the next section, inshallah. And that way you will not forget the words, inshallah, that you're learning. And you'll see how everything sort of comes together, it glues together over time. And you'll just, subhanAllah, start to, use language in a very beautiful way, all naturally, inshallah. Another way to not forget vocabulary is to read and listen a lot, right? Reading and listening, even if it's a bit non-active, as I mentioned before, it has its benefit. If you continue with it, you use it as a sort of a retention strategy as opposed to a learning strategy in the beginning, right? So you aim to retain your skills of reading and listening and competence, as opposed to learning it with for the first time, right? You learn actively, and then you retain actively as well as non-actively. Okay, so when you read, and after a point where you've learned a lot of words already, and you're, mashallah, already very competent and confident in reading most literature, there will always be words that come up that you don't know the meaning of. You'll always have to use the dictionary. It's something that even the giants have to do, right? But the more you read and the more you listen, the language stays fresh and the vocabulary stays fresh, so you don't lose your vocabulary. So reading a lot and listening a lot, right? So 3 ways of retention, inshallah, of your vocabulary. And we've already discussed your fluency. Fluency is always subject specific after you've achieved the general fluency in the language. And you just have to continue working on it. The more you read, the more you listen, the more work you put into it, inshallah, the more you will progress in that, bi-idhni ta'ala. So that marks the end of this section. We'll take another quick break, 5 to 7 minutes, inshallah, and come back for the next section, bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. You've been sitting for almost 2 hours, so I'd recommend that you guys drink some water, take a quick walk, okay, inshallah. Do some push-ups or squats, inshallah. Just get the oxygen back to your, flowing back to your mind, to your brain, inshallah. So you feel a bit more active. Perhaps go and do wudu and come back, inshallah, okay?